Hello, everybody. I'm Jane Hansen. In the arena, capital punishment, also referred to as the death penalty. It's always been a hotly debated issue, with many Americans deeply divided between pro and con. Recently, Illinois Governor Pat Quinn signed a law banning the death penalty in his state. He had previously been pro-capital punishment. His change of heart was largely influenced by the late Cardinal Joseph Bernardin of Chicago. What are the major legal and moral arguments for both sides? And what are the reasons for the Church's stance on the death penalty? Joining us now, as always, Monsignor Kieran Harrington, the Director of Communications for the Diocese of Brooklyn, and our in-studio guest, Father Michael Perry, pastor at Our Lady of Refuge Church in Brooklyn, and our regular contributor, Grant Gallicho. And then our special guest via Skype from Albany is Kathleen Gallagher, the Director of Pro-Life Activities, New York State Catholic Conference of Bishops. Welcome to all of you. Kathy, let's start with you. What exactly is the bishop's stance on the death penalty?
Well, I think the Catholic Church position on the death penalty has been misunderstood over the years. You know, the church is opposed to the use of capital punishment in our modern day society. But the church does say that the government has the right to give out the death penalty in serious, severe cases. However, since 1995, with the beautiful encyclical, The Gospel of Life, by John Paul II, our catechism has actually been changed to say, in this day and age, it's not justifiable to use capital punishment anymore because there's no need to use it, because we can adequately protect society by putting people into our prison system if we have to for the rest of their lives.
Kathy, you have been on death row. Can you tell me what that experience is like?
Well, yes, part of my job here at the Catholic Conference is to facilitate the work of the Catholic prison chaplains. And the chaplains at Dannemora at Clinton Correctional Facility, way upstate New York, invited me for a tour of their facility. And we did go through the area known as death row, which thankfully doesn't exist anymore in New York. But I'll tell you, it is a hopeless, I can only describe it as hopeless. It's a hopeless area. You feel it. It hangs in the air. It's silent, it's dark, it's dreary, it's a horrible place.
Father Perry, you do a lot of work with the Sisters of Mercy, and you are really committed to being anti-death penalty. This whole idea, what she just described as death row, with there being no hopelessness, there's no chance of redemption on earth when you're going to be executed.
And when you're dead.
Right. But I'm just saying that the reasons why you are so involved in it are because...
Well, actually, my involvement goes way, way back. And it goes back to a button. I, at one time, was the chaplain at Pratt Institute. And one of the students, in those days, they were wearing buttons with all kinds of messages. And the button said, "Why do we kill people who kill people to show that killing people is wrong?" And I couldn't argue with that logic. Because if killing people is wrong, why do we kill people who kill people? It just doesn't make sense. So from there, I went into the moral implications and also the implications of human dignity. And of course, Sisters of Mercy are very much about that, you know, protecting the dignity of the poor, the sick, the ignorant, which is part of their constitution.
In fact, you brought with you today a copy of the Hippocratic Oath, which is, of course, what doctors take. And in there, it would indicate that
the Hippocratic Oath says, interesting enough,
that it's talking about life and it's talking about what the doctor's
responsibility is. I will not give a lethal drug to anyone if I am asked, nor will I advise such a plan. And in the same sentence, and similarly, I will not give a woman a pessary, which is a pill, to cause an abortion. Way back before Jesus.
Grant, I know that this whole idea of the death penalty, and I'm sure it's resonating with you with what Father Perry's saying right now, but as Catholics and as a journalist, it's one of those issues that you have to deal with a lot. Where does that put you?
Well, I think the preponderance of evidence now is such that, not just from a moral position, but I mean from just a sort of journalistic position, that it's very difficult to look at what we now know about the way our justice system works. It's very difficult for me to support any kind of capital punishment. In Illinois, before Governor Quinn signed this ban, Governor Ryan had put a a block on all capital deaths. So that was brought about because there were some journalism students at a local college who went and looked at a bunch of cases of guys who were on death row, and they found that in about a dozen of those cases, these guys had been falsely convicted.
So the DNA actually showed ultimately.
In some cases, yes, and in others there was some
other evidence.
Yeah. But that's the thing that I think the people who look at this issue and have had a change of heart, they sense you can't take that back. Once you take someone's life, that is something the state cannot rectify.
Kathy, when you think about what happened in Illinois with the governor and his change of heart, really based upon what a bishop wrote and what a bishop told him about, does that then tell you something about the influence and the potential that bishops in the Catholic Church have in this whole issue?
Oh, absolutely. Here in New York State, much closer to home than Illinois, we had many examples, just like the governor of Illinois. For example, in 2004, the death penalty was ruled unconstitutional here in New York State by our highest court. And after that time, there were some lawmakers who were trying to fix it, like tamper with it a little bit, fix the edges, and bring back the death penalty. But we were able to convince a number of lawmakers, including, for example, Assemblyman Joe Lentol from Brooklyn, who originally was supportive of the death penalty. He was convinced by our arguments and primarily by the Holy Father, Pope John Paul II at the time, who he had met to turn his position around and vote against it. And he was one of numerous lawmakers. We're really seeing a pattern of more and more lawmakers being against the death penalty, less and less prosecutors calling for a death sentence. I really think it's a failing, waning public policy. Now there are 16 states which have abolished the use of the death penalty.
But what do you say to people, to Americans who argue, well, you know what, it's a deterrent for people to prevent people from killing?
Oh, well, that's just, I find that's almost a laughable argument. For example, just last month, some lawmakers here in New York said, we're going to try to bring back the death penalty. Just a couple of lawmakers said that for people who kill police officers in the line of duty. Well, if you look at the statistics, granted, there were a couple of killings just last month here in New York of police officers, but nothing that the death penalty would have stopped. One was, I believe, in Brooklyn, falling off of a stairwell. But anyway, in the last 3.5 years, without a death penalty, New York State saw the killing of no police officers in the line of duty. Texas, which has the most active death chamber in the country, more executions than any other state, saw 13 police officers killed in the same amount of time. So clearly the death penalty in Texas is not deterring people from murdering police officers.
Very interesting.
When I hear that kind of argument, I always think, well, does knowing that smoking causes cancer stop people from smoking? It doesn't. I mean, it's not. We don't think about the end of our life that way. It's not something that's in the moment for us.
And most of those crimes are crimes of passion, you know?
Right.
So it's not going to deter.
So, Monsignor, you know, as a priest who has to counsel people in this whole discussion, what's your take on even those in the state of New York? You know, these legislators who've come back and said maybe we should reinstate it.
I mean, I'm not compelled by the argument that an innocent person might be executed. I guess because then you could argue, well, if you could establish with moral certitude that somebody was guilty of a crime, should you then execute him? What kind of compels me is what execution does to we who are the citizens who've executed a criminal. And that kind of was driven home to me just in my own experience. As a friend of mine who said to me that when in the place where he was living there was an execution party, and I thought, how can you celebrate the execution of a criminal? It seems to be diminishing our own human dignity, not necessarily the dignity of the person who's executed, but it seems to diminish our dignity.
I totally agree with that. I once spoke to a man when we were working very hard down at the legislature to lobby lawmakers against the death penalty back in the 90s. I worked with a man named Ralph Byrd, whose father had been murdered. He was a cab driver, and he was murdered for $3 that he had on him that night. And Ralph said to me, you know, I would like to get my hands on those murderers, and I'd kill them myself. You know, that feeling of vengeance was absolutely instinctive and probably normal for most of us. But he said, I don't think the state has the right to kill the people who murdered my father. The state is supposed to set an example. And does the state go out and rape people who rape other people? It's silly. It's like, as Father said earlier, you shouldn't kill people to show that killing is wrong.
But if Ralph had gone out and tried to kill those people, then he would most likely be on death row someplace right now. So,
exactly.
Okay. Kathy, we thank you so much. Any last thoughts before we leave you today?
Well, I think, the church has many reasons why we oppose capital punishment, but the fundamental reason is the basic principle of Catholic social teaching, which is every human life is sacred, made in the image and likeness of God, therefore deserving of our respect and deserving of the respect of the law, no matter what that person may have done in his or her past.
All right. Kathy, we thank you so very much. Kathy's the Director of Pro-Life Activities, New York State Catholic Conference of Bishops. Father Perry is going to stick with us for the next segment. We will take a break right now, but we want to invite you to weigh in our discussion anytime by going to our website at netny.net and click on Enter the Arena. We welcome your questions and comments, and we'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone, as we continue our discussion on capital punishment. We are joined once again by our in-studio guest, Father Michael Perry, pastor at Our Lady of Refuge Church in Brooklyn. And now our guest via telephone is David Kaczynski, Executive Director of New Yorkers for Alternatives to the Death Penalty, NYADP. David, let's start with you. People probably recognize your name because of your brother, Ted, the so-called Unabomber. I'm assuming that that is what got you to where you are today.
Yeah, Jane, I'd always been opposed to the death penalty, I think on ethical grounds. I'm not opposed to the taking of a human life in a situation where, self-defense or national defense or police need to use weapons to repel a violent aggressor. To me, those instances of taking life can be justified, but I never thought that we should take a human life, in judgment. That somehow didn't seem to lie within, the capacity of human beings to do. But I certainly, it became personal for me in 1995 when my wife Linda and I read the Unabomber's Manifesto published in the Washington Post and came to the very disturbing conclusion that the author might be my brother. Now the Unabomber at this point was the most wanted person in America, had over a period of 17 years sent 16 bombs through the mail. Number of people had been injured, 3 had been killed. And so, Linda and I kind of investigated, and the more we investigated, the clearer it seemed to us that we needed to act, we needed to do something. And I think at that point we really came up against a kind of moral contradiction of the death penalty. We truly felt we had a moral obligation to save lives, to protect the public. On the other hand, the cost of doing so could well have been my own brother's life, since the crimes he committed were capital crimes, and his trial began as a death penalty trial. Now, I'd have to say that when my brother was arrested, they found another bomb in his cabin, ready to be mailed to someone. So I thank God, I thank Linda for the courage, the encouragement to do the right thing.
That must have been
protect the public.
So painfully hard. And today you actually speak out along with one of your brother's victims who survived and another man who's also turned his own brother in, and the brother was executed, I believe.
Yes, actually my brother had nearly killed a man named Gary Wright, who owned a computer store in Salt Lake City, Utah in 1987. And through the course of the trial and getting to know each other, Gary and I have become great friends. We've spoken out against the death penalty together, and we also speak on subjects of healing and responses to violence that bring out the best in our humanity.
So David, after having had this very personal experience, when you see that the world out there, that Americans, by a big majority believe that the death penalty should be the law in this country. Well, how do you respond to that?
I think, it's an abstract issue for people. People imagine a horrible crime and think in many ways justifiably that the person who committed that crime is, deserves the ultimate punishment. I think when people are educated a little bit more on the system and that they understand that when we try to play God, we too often make mistakes, it's at that point when you begin to see minds change. There have been now 140 people exonerated from death row in the United States by DNA and other means, people who were sentenced to death who committed no crime at all. And others we know of, particularly in Texas, who have been executed and then proven innocent after post-execution. I think that's changed a lot of minds. It's the realization that we don't have a perfect system, and death is irreversible. If you incarcerate someone who's committed an awful crime, you can let them out if you find out later on that they were actually innocent.
Well,
but if you put them to death, there's no making up for it.
Right, which is the point that Father Perry made earlier. And Father Perry, you also talk about the fact that we in the U.S. that if you compare us to the rest of the world, that a lot of most European countries don't have anything like a death penalty.
More than they don't have it, they've outlawed it. I mean, they've said, no, we will not have it. So they've made it an express part of the European Constitution, for example, to say, if you want to be part of the European Union, you may not practice the death penalty.
So are you saying that we think we're so sophisticated and so evolved, and yet here we are acting in this particular case, in the issue of the death penalty, like third world nations?
I think we're being arrogant. I think that we're refusing to accept the wisdom of other people with whom we share this planet.
Father Monsignor, one of the things that David is talking about, obviously, is the morality from his own personal experience. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the whole moral issue of the death penalty and, that thought in the Bible, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But the reality is that's not...
What justice's mind saith the Lord is the conclusion of that passage. And I think
Jesus says.
That's right. I mean, for us, I think it's important for us to recognize that, and I think Kathy had alluded to this, and I think this is an important point. Society does have the right to defend itself. And at certain points in our history, that right extended to the taking of those who posed a threat to the society, taking the life of those who posed a threat to our society. We still believe that there is a just war, right? That there is a possibility of a just war. A nation can defend itself. As David was mentioning, that a police officer can defend his life from an aggressor. The question is today is that we do have the capability to incarcerate someone, to isolate dangerous individuals from the rest of society. And the question becomes is that when we execute them, what does that do to us? I can't help but think about when we take a look at the footage of a beheading in Afghanistan, and the people cheering outside, we look at that and recoil with horror. Mm-hmm. And yet at the same time,
right now,
that same sense of celebration seems to take place in our own country when a criminal, a heinous criminal, and let's assume that the person actually did commit the crime, has been executed. There shouldn't be a celebration over a tragedy where a person takes another human being's life, and that's the issue for us, I think.
David, how do you find you must have had contact with people who have survived victims of very heinous crimes. How do you get them to see the point that you're trying to make? How do you get families and survivors to come around on this issue?
As part of my personal journey, it was very important for me to reach out to some of my brother's victims and to talk with them. And I think part of my own personal healing has involved meetings and interactions and conversations and discussions and ultimately friendships and close working relationships with murder victim family members. And I believe I've learned an awful lot from them. Some of the leaders of our movement are murder victim family members who oppose the death penalty on moral grounds, and also because they think this process is very destructive to a victim's healing. As we know, we sentence people to death. They may end up on death row for 20 or 25 years, especially in a case where someone sentenced to death has been found innocent. The victim in the case is terribly re-victimized, and all of them dispute the idea that there can be any closure. Their lives have been changed by an act of violence forever, and the task at this point is to recover trust, to recover a sense of the integrity of our human community. And so many of them have inspired me by working against violence, and also for victims' rights and for victim services. But it's the work of victims against violence that I've found the most inspiring to me, and it really has governed our organization's new mission in the post-abolition era in New York.
And David, I guess we do have to go, so as a final thought from you, is everything you're doing, did it all become necessary for you because of perhaps a sense of guilt that you felt for your brother's behavior? I mean, how that healing process for you, just how has that been?
Well, it's complicated. I wouldn't say I feel guilt about what my brother did because I had no part of it. He's a separate person. He has a serious mental illness. On the other hand, we can never change what happened to us. Well, the real challenge is how do we go forward in a positive way? And I felt a strong moral obligation to work against the death penalty, as strong as the moral obligation I felt to turn my brother in to prevent his violence.
David, we thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today, David Kaczynski. Father Perry, last thoughts from you on this issue?
Why do we kill people who kill people? To show that killing people is wrong.
We go back to where we started with you.
Yep.
That's the bottom line. Thank you so much, Father.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And we are going to take a break, but we'll continue our discussion with some final thoughts. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. Continuing our conversation, we're joined once again by Monsignor Kieran Harrington, the Director of Communications for the Diocese of Brooklyn, and our regular contributors, Elizabeth Scalia, Managing Editor of the Catholic Portal at Pathos.com, and Grant Gallicho, the Associate Editor of Commonweal magazine. All right, you guys, look, here's the only thing I can think of is, do you remember the case in Connecticut? We recently saw day after day after day in the New York papers and on television the story of the guy, the trial of the guy who killed a woman and her two daughters. Remember, it was painful. It was disgusting, the way in which they depicted what happened. How can you not want that man to pay for that crime with his life?
Well, you do want it, but you can't have it. You can't have it if you want to live in a moral, reasonable, humane, dignified world. And that's the issue. And it's a very difficult line to tread, because on one hand, when you see a story like that, or you see a story like the abortion doctor in Philadelphia who killed thousands of babies with savagery, you say, I don't want that guy to live. I don't want him to live on my taxpayer dime. He certainly deserves to die. And yet John Paul II was very clear in his encyclical that you have no business, we have no business taking away the opportunity for someone to seek out mercy. And certainly people like that may need a long time to come to that point where they're looking for mercy. And so that's got to be our bottom line. I desire mercy is what God said.
But I think also when you think about the death penalty, your point about the students, the college students coming up with enough evidence to take men, women off death row, that the point that there is so much discrimination in the death penalty too. Can you address that? You go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I'm just thinking that there is a lot of discrimination, but there's an inconsistency here. And I was thinking about it while I was listening to Father speak, and he was saying, well, the Europeans don't have this and we shouldn't have it either. Well, that's true. But the Europeans also, abort like crazy, and so do we. And I think this inconsistent, schizophrenic idea that we have that some life issues are moral and they deserve our umbrage and our attention, and then others are kind of annoying. Everybody should be able to do what they want. We have a seamless garment or we don't.
Well, I don't necessarily agree this is a seamless garment issue. I mean, I think that there is a difference between the willful taking of innocent human life and the death penalty on a moral basis. I think there are differences.
Still death. one way
Yeah,
or
but,
another, right?
yes, but I mean there are certain things which are more egregious than others, even things which are sinful and wrong. That being said, I think that there is a question that you just raised, is the inequities in the criminal justice system, and there are many, because if you take a look at the criminal justice system and you see the number of African American Latinos who are in the criminal justice system, it's clearly evidence of bias. Now there will be people out there who say, well, you know, there's greater criminal activity in these communities. You know, that's simply not the case. I mean, when one takes a look at the criminal justice system, there are certain people who do not have access to the same number of same resources in terms of defense attorneys, and so as a result, I think that there happen to be more Black and Latinos who are on death row, and that's the evidence of that's where there is some evidence of bias. New York State, the last person to be executed was Eddie Mays in 1863. It was a robbery, and a person was killed in the commission of a robbery. I think that if you take a look and say what has happened in New York State, I think that we do have a sense of respecting the dignity and sanctity of human life for those who are in prison. The challenge for us is on the question of the unborn.
I think for the church, this is a fascinating issue because it shows that there has been some development on this particular teaching. John Paul's teaching made it a lot harder for Catholics to accept capital punishment. And I think that the preponderance of evidence simply makes it, for me anyway, it's just, I can't accept it. We can do better.
Elizabeth, last thoughts?
I'll go back to I desire mercy, and we need to be consistent. We need to find a way to respect the human dignity in all of its forms, guilty or innocent.
But do any of you expect that this huge majority of Americans that's for capital punishment is actually going to change anytime soon?
I think it's starting to shift. It's going to take quite some time, though.
I think people are finding that you can't be utilitarian about human life. If you are against euthanasia, then you can't really be for putting somebody to death because the tax paradigm shouldn't support people for 40 years, which is what I see a lot in my email.
It doesn't matter to me that the vast majority of people support the death penalty. The fact is it's wrong, and we have an obligation to speak up when there is injustice, despite the fact that there might be huge majorities that oppose our voice.
And that's going to be our final thought. Thank you, all of you, Grant, Elizabeth, Monsignor. And thank you again for being with us. And remember that you don't need a TV to watch the net. We are always online at netny.net. For all of us here, I'm Jane Hansen. We'll see you next time in the arena.